The ship that vanished into hell. How HMS Erebus discovered Antarctica's true horror in 1841. What if I told you that the same ship that helped discover Antarctica's deepest secrets later vanished in the Arctic with its entire crew, and that the Antarctic expedition revealed why they never stood a chance? On January 12, 1841, two British naval vessels, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, smashed through the pack ice of the Ross Sea and became the first ships in history to penetrate deep into Antarctic waters. What Captain James Clark Ross and his 128 crew members discovered that day would revolutionize science, rewrite geography, and reveal a truth so terrifying about polar exploration that it should have stopped all future expeditions immediately. Instead, the British Admiralty ignored the warnings, sent the same ships and many of the same men to the Arctic 4 years later, and created one of history's most horrific maritime disasters. This is the true story of how Antarctica tried to warn us and how we refused to listen. The mission into the unknown. In 1839, the British Admiralty assembled one of the most ambitious scientific expeditions in naval history. Their goal, to sail farther south than any humans had ever gone, to find the South Magnetic Pole, and to claim as much of the Antarctic continent as possible for the British Crown. To lead this mission, they chose James Clark Ross, a 39-year-old captain who had spent his entire adult life in polar regions. Ross had already located the North Magnetic Pole in 1831. He was experienced, competent, and respected. If anyone could unlock Antarctica's secrets, it was Ross. The ships chosen were HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, both bomb vessels designed to carry heavy mortars for bombarding coastal fortifications. This made them extraordinarily sturdy, with reinforced hulls that could theoretically withstand ice pressure. Both ships were further strengthened for the expedition. Their bows were reinforced with iron, internal heating systems installed, and their hulls doubled with additional planking. The crew of 128 men included scientists, naturalists, artists, and experienced polar sailors. They carried enough provisions for 3 years. They had the best navigation equipment available in 1839. They were, by any measure, prepared for the challenge ahead. What they weren't prepared for was what Antarctica would show them about the limits of human endurance and the futility of naval technology against nature's absolute cold. The first revelation, the ice barrier. After months of sailing, fighting through storms and dodging icebergs the size of cathedrals, Ross's expedition made their first major discovery on January 11, 1841. Through the Antarctic fog, they saw something that shouldn't exist. 2 enormous volcanoes rising from the frozen landscape. Ross named them Mount Erebus and Mount Terror after his ships. Mount Erebus was actively erupting, belching smoke and fire into the polar sky, a surreal vision of hell in the middle of absolute cold. The men stood on deck, watching this impossible sight, a volcano on a continent of ice, fire, and frost coexisting in a landscape that seemed designed to break human comprehension. But the truly devastating discovery came the next day. On January 12th, as they sailed south along the coast, they encountered something that stopped them cold, literally. Ahead of them, stretching from horizon to horizon, rose a wall of ice. Not pack ice that could be navigated around, not icebergs that could be avoided, but a sheer cliff of ice rising 150 to 200 feet straight up from the water, extending as far as they could see in both directions. This was the Ross Ice Shelf, though they didn't know what to call it then. It was, and remains, one of the largest ice formations on Earth, roughly the size of France, up to 2,500 feet thick in places, floating on the ocean, but impossible to sail through or over. Lieutenant Archibald McMurdo wrote in his journal that night, "We have sailed to the end of the navigable world. Before us lies a barrier not of water or land, but of ice so vast and perpendicular that no ship could ever pass it. We have reached not a continent shore, but a wall built by God or the devil to keep mortals from proceeding further." Ross was devastated. He had hoped to sail to the South Magnetic Pole, or at least close to it. Now he realized the magnetic pole lay somewhere behind this impenetrable wall of ice, forever out of reach by sea. The deadly discovery. But Ross was stubborn. For the next 2 months, he sailed east along the ice barrier, desperately searching for a break, a bay, anywhere they might penetrate further south. They found nothing. The ice wall was absolute, unbroken, stretching for over 600 miles. During this time, something began happening to the crew that terrified Ross more than the ice itself. They were deteriorating psychologically. The ship's surgeon, Robert McCormick, began documenting strange symptoms among the men. They included the white blindness, men staring at the endless white landscape, white ice, white sky, white fog, began losing depth perception. Some couldn't tell if objects were 10 feet or 10 miles away. Several men walked into walls or fell down stairs because their brains could no longer process spatial relationships. 2 men went temporarily blind despite no physical damage to their eyes, a psychosomatic response to the sensory deprivation. The silence madness. Antarctica is preternaturally quiet. No birds inland, no insects, no rustling leaves, no rain. The silence is so complete that men reported hearing their own heartbeat constantly, hearing blood rushing through their ears, becoming convinced something was wrong with them because the world shouldn't be this quiet. 3 men developed obsessive behaviors, counting, tapping, humming, desperately trying to fill the silence. The nowhere syndrome. In the featureless white expanse, men began feeling like they were nowhere, that they had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Several crew members showed symptoms of dissociation, reporting feeling disconnected from their bodies, questioning whether they were real or dreaming. The rage. Confined to ships for months in brutal cold, with the sun either never setting in summer or never rising in winter, men's tempers became explosive. Minor disagreements escalated to violence. Ross had to break up several fights that could have resulted in murder. In one incident, a sailor attacked another with a knife over an imagined insult, screaming that he couldn't bear another minute trapped in this white hell. McCormick's medical log became increasingly alarming. He wrote, "The Antarctic is not merely cold, it is psychologically poisonous. The human mind was not designed to function in this environment. I fear what will become of us if we remain much longer." The warning ignored. When HMS Erebus and HMS Terror returned to England in September 1843, they were celebrated as heroes. They had sailed farther south than anyone in history. They had discovered the Ross Sea, the Ross Ice Shelf, and the two volcanoes. They had collected valuable magnetic measurements and scientific specimens. But Ross's private reports to the Admiralty told a different story. He warned that polar exploration had severe psychological costs that hadn't been properly understood. He recommended that future expeditions be shorter, that crews be rotated more frequently, and that special attention be paid to mental health. He specifically wrote, "The ice and cold can be survived with proper preparation, but the isolation, the sensory deprivation, the endless white emptiness, these attack the mind itself. Men can endure the cold. I am not certain they can endure the nothingness." The Admiralty read his reports, thanked him for his service, and then promptly ignored every warning he'd given them. The Arctic Nightmare. In 1845, just 2 years after returning from Antarctica, HMS Erebus and HMS Terra were refitted and sent on another polar expedition. This time, the goal was to find the Northwest Passage through the Canadian Arctic. The Admiralty chose Sir John Franklin to command the expedition. Franklin was 59 years old, hadn't led a ship in years, and was overweight and in poor health. But he was well connected politically, and he wanted one last glorious expedition before retirement. Many of Ross's Antarctic crew volunteered to go, including the ice masters, who had learned polar navigation in the South. The ships carried provisions for 3 years, the same reinforced hulls that had served them well in Antarctica, and the confidence that came from having survived the world's most hostile waters. On May 19, 1845, HMS Erebus and HMS Terra sailed from England with 134 men. They were last seen by European whalers in Baffin Bay in July 1845. Then they vanished. For 2 years, no word came. Then 3. The Admiralty sent search expeditions. Nothing. More search expeditions. Nothing. Over the next decade, more than 30 rescue missions searched the Canadian Arctic. They found scattered clues, abandoned equipment, cairns with fragmentary messages, 3 graves on Beechey Island. Then, in 1854, Scottish explorer John Rae encountered Inuit people who had seen white men starving and dying years earlier. They told stories of cannibalism, of men eating their dead shipmates in desperation. They showed Rae items from the expedition: silver forks with officers' initials, a gold watch, naval buttons. The truth slowly emerged through Inuit testimony and archaeological findings. HMS Erebus and HMS Terra had become trapped in ice off King William Island in September 1846. Unlike Antarctic ice that's often mobile, Arctic pack ice can remain solid for years. The ships never escaped. The crews survived the first winter, then the second winter. By the 3rd year, they were running out of food. Franklin died in June 1847. By April 1848, the ships were still trapped, and the surviving 105 men made the decision to abandon ship and attempt to walk to safety. They never made it. All 105 men died, mostly from starvation and hypothermia, over the following months. Modern forensic analysis of recovered remains shows evidence of scurvy, lead poisoning from the ship's poorly salted cans, tuberculosis, and yes, in the final stages, cannibalism. What Antarctica had tried to teach them. Here's the horrifying truth that connects these expeditions. Everything that killed Franklin's men in the Arctic had already been observed and documented during the Antarctic expedition, but the warnings were ignored. The psychological deterioration, the same mental breakdown McCormick documented in Antarctica. The dissociation, the rage, the cognitive impairment happened in the Arctic. Men trapped for years in ice made increasingly irrational decisions. They abandoned the ship's remaining supplies when they still had food. They hauled heavy items like desks and books on their desperate march instead of focusing on survival necessities. These weren't decisions made by rational minds. They were decisions made by men whose psyches had been shattered by years in the ice. The lead poisoning, the same tinned provisions that had sustained the Antarctic expedition in 1841 to 1843, were used in the Arctic. But Franklin's expedition stayed out longer, 3 years in the ice instead of 3 years total voyage. The lead solder in the tins slowly poisoned the crews. Symptoms include confusion, aggression, and impaired judgment. Exactly what survivors' actions suggest. The scurvy. Despite knowing scurvy was a risk, Ross had dealt with minor cases in Antarctica. Franklin's expedition didn't carry enough anti-scorbutics, vitamin C sources. This was a failure of planning based on overconfidence from the Antarctic success. The wrong lessons. The Admiralty concluded from the Antarctic expedition that British ships and British men could survive anywhere cold. They missed Ross's critical warning: survival isn't just physical, it's psychological, and the human mind has limits in these environments. The ship's final fate, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, remained lost for 168 years. Then, in a stunning series of discoveries, Parks Canada located HMS Erebus in 2014 and HMS Terror in 2016, both remarkably well preserved in the cold Arctic waters. Underwater archaeology revealed that both ships had been carefully maintained even after being abandoned. Hatches were properly sealed, supplies were neatly stowed, and the ships showed evidence of having been lived in for years. The crews hadn't given up on them suddenly. They had tried everything to survive, maintained discipline and order to the end, and only abandoned the ships when it was absolutely clear they would never escape the ice. Divers exploring HMS Erebus found a poignant detail. In the captain's cabin were drawings and watercolors of Antarctic landscapes, the volcanoes, the ice shelf, the mountains. Someone, probably Franklin himself, had kept these mementos from the earlier expedition, perhaps remembering what they thought had been their greatest triumph, not realizing it had been a warning. The legacy of ignored warnings. The Franklin expedition's loss shocked Victorian Britain. It was the greatest naval disaster in peacetime history. 134 men, 2 advanced ships, and millions in equipment simply gone. It spawned dozens of search expeditions, hundreds of books and articles, and eventually a complete rethinking of polar exploration. But here's what makes this story truly significant. If the Admiralty had heeded Ross's warnings from Antarctica, Franklin's expedition might never have been sent or would have been organized completely differently. Ross had discovered not just a new sea and ice shelf, he had discovered the psychological limits of polar exploration. The Antarctic expedition of 1841 was actually more dangerous and more revealing than anyone at the time understood. The crew experienced severe psychological trauma, but were able to escape before it became fatal, because they were on ships that could still move, could still retreat. Franklin's crew experienced the same trauma, but were trapped, unable to escape, and that made all the difference. Ross himself lived until 1862, long enough to see the Franklin disaster unfold and to know his warnings had been ignored. In his later years, he rarely spoke about either expedition. When he did, he would say, "Antarctica told us the truth about the ice. We simply refused to believe it." Conclusion: the price of hubris. On January 12, 1841, when HMS Erebus and HMS Terra reached the Ross Ice Shelf, they didn't just discover a geographic feature, they discovered a fundamental truth about human limits. The ice barrier wasn't just physical, it was metaphorical. It was nature saying, "This far, no farther." The British Admiralty, riding high on imperial confidence, interpreted the Antarctic expedition as proof that British technology and British courage could conquer any environment. They saw the successful return of both ships and took it as validation. They missed the real lesson, written in McCormick's medical logs and Ross's confidential reports. The human mind breaks in the polar regions. Not might break, will break, given enough time. The Antarctic expedition succeeded not because they had conquered the ice, but because they escaped before the ice conquered them. 4 years later, HMS Erebus and HMS Terra returned to polar waters, this time with no escape route. The same ships that had survived Antarctica became frozen coffins in the Arctic. The men who had volunteered thinking they had already proven they could survive polar conditions died slowly and horribly in the ice. Today, climate scientists visit Antarctica regularly to study the ice cores, to measure the melting, to understand how this frozen continent will shape our planet's future. They go for weeks or months, then leave. They understand what the Victorians didn't. Antarctica allows visitors, but it doesn't tolerate residents. The continent that tried to warn us in 1841 is now warning us again through melting ice and rising seas. Perhaps this time we should listen.